Hey folks, thanks very much for joining our Monday Mindshare this week. And what a month June was. It was full of racing around the world, and we saw some awesome results. And we also saw a bunch of interesting observations across athletes priming and simulating and getting ready for races, and obviously in the races. And today I wanted to share some of those observations of what worked well, what didn't work so well, and some areas of improvement in thinking about future racing and optimizing nutritional choices either prior to or during races. And I'll share some content here to help us guide us through the discussion. But we'll try to keep this fairly informative in the context of real case studies of some of the athletes racing around the world during July with the SFuels team, or just themselves as a customer of SFuels, and some of the inquiries that have come in to help them optimize their nutrition. So some of this is a little text heavy, but I'll try to talk to it more so than just read it. This first case is really around race simulation training. It's something we all do as we get closer to races. We want to understand not just how our aerobic or basically our high intensity capacity is, but also want to understand just how our nutrition and frankly even hydration is working relative to the duration and ideally the simulation of the ambient temperature, simulation of the race course, etc., as best we can. And in this particular case, the athlete was going from a lot of training of sub 2.5 hours, and then moved to race simulation training of 3-4 hour sessions. And this was a brick of bike and run, and was noticing during the latter part of the bike starting to cramping sensations in the legs, and also a looseness in the gut on the run. And when we started looking at some of the data with the athlete and had some really good discussions with the athlete, and a lot of this, when you think about doing simulation training, when you find things out, sometimes it's too late to make corrective actions before the next imminent race. So sometimes we do need to just, take stock of what we have and what we're ready for the race, use what's known, and not try to reinvent the wheel in the last 4 weeks until race day. But in this particular case, the athlete talked us through a number of data points about their diet, about their nutrition they use in training, and then their plan for racing, and also their oxidation rates. And what was interesting here, and the athlete was very upfront about this in the spirit of they're really just in the process of transitioning across to improving fat oxidation efficiency. In fact, on the bike, it was around 0.5 or a half a gram per minute of fat being oxidized, and on the run, 0.9 grams per minute being oxidized. So what you would say here is that really on the bike, there's really not a lot of fat oxidation efficiency happening. And as a function of that, you are clearly burning a lot more carbohydrate on the bike. And if you don't get your nutrition right on the bike, then when you get to the run, you're going to be in all sorts of trouble, particularly in half Ironman distances where you're going beyond that 3 to 4 hour space. And in that, of course, you've generally used most of your muscle and liver glycogen. So some of the, when you looked at the use of SFuels products here, there was really, in the spirit of this being training, and you're really trying to hone and improve and really stimulate fat oxidation efficiency, the use here of Race Plus is probably overdone. There's a couple of comments I would make before we get to the takeaways down the bottom of the screen here, and that is that really in the early stages of improving fat oxidation, you would be better to lean heavier on Race Plus, on Train, SFuels Train, and really limit the use of carbohydrate, whether that's Race Plus or any other product. In this case, too, I see that the use of SFuels Train was really just for the first 30 minutes. The reason why there's a range in terms of moving from SFuels TRAIN to SFuels Race Plus, is because that depends a lot on the intensity of the actual session. When you do have good fat oxidation efficiency and it is a high intensity session, you probably could get away with in 30 minutes shifting from SFuels TRAIN across to Race Plus and have the channels open in the muscles to receive glucose out of the blood into the muscle cells, largely in the absence of insulin. In the case where that metabolic efficiency is not right, not effective, you may find that that takes longer. So those two kind of things, observations here, is that they were probably not using SFuels TRAIN enough, period, and we'll talk about that in a second. And secondly, they used it for too short amount of time before jumping to Race Plus. And then lastly, I just think the amount of Race Plus being used here would really have not really facilitate or support triggering a lot of fat oxidation efficiency. Now, remember that this athlete had spent most of their training also leading up to this point in that sub 2.5 hour as their long session. And my feedback to that also would be that you really do need to get into the 3, 4, 4 hour plus durations, particularly if you're thinking Ironman, and certainly it will help for half Ironman. And I would say the same for anything more than a marathon or beyond, ultra marathon, etc. And the reason for that is you do want to get into those states whereby you've largely exhausted a lot or most of the liver and muscle glycogen, and it's then that the body is forced to use its enzymes and begin to train and improve those enzyme systems associated with the breakdown of fat, the transport of fat, and the oxidation of fat. So the three takeaways here is really, look, if your fat oxidation is not optimal, and general guidance here would be, we probably should be above 1 gram a minute, ideally in that around 1.2 grams per minute. But if you're not there, if you're in this case, 0.5 gram a minute, then you really don't want to go into race simulation and obviously the race itself trying to emulate a low-carb form of fueling for a race. You simply will begin to have insufficient substrate and fuel to get through the race with efficiency. The second point I would make is that your focus, rather than trying to do these simulations here on mixing train and race plus, you would be better just to spend more of your time in zone 2 in those 3 to 4 hour sessions and on SFuels TRAIN, whereby there's basically no carbohydrate. And that is really what I would focus and spend my time on. That will give you the best bang for buck on getting the efficiency right. The general diet will have the gut somewhat aware of carbohydrate intakes, etc. Whatever that is in your particular diet, whether that is, vegetable, whether that is rice or potato or what have you. It's not like you're going from a 0 carbohydrate in the general diet. So I would focus your training sessions more on zone 2, longer sessions, just use SFuels TRAIN to really improve and spend your time in training on improving your fat oxidation efficiency. And look, at the end of the day, if you are not, there's a lot of misinterpretation with fatigue in that as you're getting tighter, the translation of that for a lot of folks is, a lot of athletes, is that I'm insufficient I have insufficient fuel. And really, in a lot of cases, that interpretation of insufficient fuel is met with increasing the intake, whether that is, again, in training. In this case, you can see a fairly high dose of Race Plus, or it could be even in the race, as you go through the aid stations, is really beginning to overconsume carbohydrate. And look, if the gut is simply not absorbing it, and there could be a number of reasons for that, and we'll talk in the second case I'll share in a second on when this happens. But expect to see that the typical symptoms of that is looseness in the gut. It can be cramping, can be nauseous, can be diarrhea. And then accompanying that, because you're not getting the nutrition coming into the blood supply and out into the muscles, obviously weakness or cramping or both, etc. In the training session or the racing session. So they're the three key takeaways I'd have for this case. And we're certainly planning to work with this athlete post this race he's got coming up. I've asked them, look, just focus on what you did prior in terms of your carbohydrate consumption. It's something that you're used to. Your fat ox first needs work. Let's focus on that after the race, and we'll get into that with this particular athlete. The second athlete is Matt Cara. Some of you are probably following Matt on social media. He went into Ironman Cairns really in good shape. And unfortunately, as he came out of the swim, and if you actually look at his times, he had one of the fastest swims he's ever had in Ironman, 48 minutes. It's impressive stuff. But then began in the second half of the bike. You see here in I guess it's probably more, it's actually probably not quite the second half, but it began to have this reflux of liquid. And, if you listen to Matt's podcast himself, he talks a lot about, it coming, from the stomach and, basically throwing up, if you will, on the bike. And as a function of that, really was restricted on how much he could take. Now, one of the things they called out, him and Grant, on the podcast is that coming out of the swim, he probably took on a lot more than he typically would in a shorter amount of time. And, when I say a lot more than usual, let's put it that way. And as a function of this, the second half of the bike, Matt began to lose power. And if you look at his Ironman Cairns times last year, when we worked with Matt on Cairns, he was like 20 minutes faster on the bike than he was this year. So clearly something went wrong in the gut. Interestingly enough, he bounced back on the run, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But a number of things here. It was interesting when I first spoke to Matt after the race about all of this, and we commented when we were watching this on Ironman Live that the watercolor was not at all typical Cairns watercolor. It was a brown color, which if you've seen the photos of Cairns coastline, it's typically not like that. So there's always the risk factor of, in the swim, taking on some water. He didn't feel like he did. But of course, you don't need a lot if it does have some type of contaminant in it. But one of the things I would say, and we're going to get on to putting this risk factor aside for a second, but let's just for a brief second talk about gut health going into races. A couple of things here. One is, as you're getting closer to race, whether it is the stress of the race or frankly life stress with the race coupled together, that absolutely can have a detrimental effect on the gut lining and on the ability of the gut to handle, any type of threat of some type of microbe, etc., contaminant. And, I would always generally guide, as you think about coming into races, where a lot of races are in a different location. And the nuance here is that the water is different. We can end up having slightly different diet to what we would have when we're at home. And these things can cause some, if you will, instability of the gut than we're typically used to. And I would generally be guiding on thinking about what you typically eat at home, trying to keep it similar as you go to your race location, and generally would guide people as you go to a race location to use filtered water. But let's put that whole risk aside for a second. It is a bit of a who knows factor. Maybe that's what happened. He took something on during the swim, and certainly after the race, he still had some gut problems at both ends for a day or so. But let's put all that aside for a second and just also look at, this is a professional athlete, and like all professional athletes, they're really training and executing on the edge. The edge meaning, too much training, too little training, too much carbohydrate, too little carbohydrate, they're right on the edge. And, Matt is a right fuel, right time athlete with SFuels. He has one of the highest fat oxidation rates we've seen. At one point, it was at 1.8 grams per minute. And, Matt tripled his fat oxidation rates working with his coach and with SFuels. But, it is true that as you begin to get over 60 grams per hour of carbohydrate, you do begin to get into a higher risk of gut distress. And that can represent itself either upper gut distress, which is what Matt was having here, or obviously lower gut distress, which is more your bloating and diarrhea, etc. Both cases, of course, you begin to have insufficient nutrient and substrate fuel coming on board because either you're getting rid of it or it's going straight through your gut. Now, in pro athletes, though, they can be even as 90, and we've seen some athletes talking about 120 grams per hour, which is frankly quite ridiculous. If you look at one of Dan Plew's recent blogs, he talked about basically over 90 grams per hour. Your body cannot oxidize any more than that anyway. So there's no value over 90 grams per hour. Now, I think in the case of Matt, while he does some of the most, what would I say, fasted long sessions I've heard of, like 8-hour fasted sessions, at the same time, when Matt does high intensity sessions, tempo sessions or race simulation sessions, he's also testing this high carbohydrate intake for his race. And in Matt's case, that can be as high as 100 grams per hour. Now, you're already in the very high risk area. And, you mix that with either a microbe issue, a contaminant issue, or you mix that with, I just took a little more than usual. So now you're over the 100 grams per hour. You're in just extremely high risk areas. And obviously the gut can react. There are other factors here which can obviously add to this. Obviously, hot water swims can further exacerbate this. The weather in general, humid, hot environments can exacerbate this. And obviously stress can exacerbate this. Now, what was interesting, though, saying all of that, is that while Matt's bike time wasn't his best bike time, his swim time was, he got to the run. He said he drew a line in the sand at T2, and it was like it was, if you will, the start of a new race in a sense. Still wasn't feeling great. He talked about his first few kilometers not being, typically where he would run those first few kilometers. At the end of the day, and this is just ties back to the ability of having such a strong fat oxidation efficiency and metabolism, is that he still ran a sub 3-hour marathon after all that. And it was largely on the run, a without carb intake run. And that just shows you that even in that case where you've got rid of most of your nutrient on the bike, and then you hit the run, and you're largely running, in his case, what is that, 4-minute Ks, etc., somewhere around there, for 42 Ks, and doing that largely without carbohydrate. He may have had a little something through the aid stations, but nothing like he would used to on account of the gut situation. So, I think there is a real resilience also you can see in having a strong fat oxidation efficiency, that for whatever reason, should you have bad gut on the day during the bike, if you just back off the carbohydrate, if you can just get some basic fluids down, keep your electrolytes up, you still can have a decent race day, particularly on the run. The third case I want to talk about is Dan's race, and just the post that he put out on social. So Dan finished Challenge Roth 8:18, and you may have known that he actually went for the best part of a month prior to race day with quite a severe Achilles condition, and for that matter, his run was not as intense as he typically runs. And obviously going into a race with very light time on your feet from a run perspective, clearly, if you will, the musculature, the joints, etc., weren't just ready for, Dan's typical marathon pace. At the end of the day, though, an amazing result of 8:18. He knows he could even go harder and faster if he was fully healthy going into the race. And obviously he's thinking about options. But just looking at his intake of nutrients, he primed prior to the race with caffeine to try to uplift the fat oxidation efficiency. You'll see that he had also some caffeine in his bottles on his bike. So now you've got, sufficient caffeine that really is going to upregulate your fat oxidation. If you look at this 225 grams of carbohydrate taken across the whole bike ride, translates to about 50 grams per hour. And he's looking to kind of balance that up in the way of ingesting some of this drink mix every 20 minutes. He also has some ketones in there from Delta G. So he's got really a mix of substrates between carbohydrate, MCT, and the ketones. And then on the run, this is really interesting. And this was the same when we were with Dan in 2018 in Hawaii, when he set the world record for the age group there. 50 grams of carbohydrates for the totality of the run is it's almost next to nothing. And he did the same in Hawaii. And his general feeling on this is probably, less is more when it comes to the run. If you do have a good fat oxidation metabolism in place and you have fueled well throughout the entirety of the bike, you shouldn't need a whole lot of intakes from a carbohydrate perspective, substrate perspective on the run. Obviously, grab some water, electrolytes, and Coke on the run, but not a lot. If you looked at some of his blogs on his Hawaii race, you would see the same approach. So a few takeaways here is, firstly, really it surprises me still after, a year and a half of really providing a lot of detail about pre-race priming of fat oxidation by the use of caffeine. More athletes are not doing this. It does require around 2.5 to 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. So if you're a 70 kilogram person, you need somewhere around 200 milligrams of caffeine. So that's the first point, is really trying to uplift your fat oxidation rate so you can heavily rely on that, leverage that, and minimize your drawdown, if you will, on carbohydrate to fuel your race. The second point is, maximize your intakes on the bike, maximize your fat oxidation on the bike with caffeine, and stay in that sub 60 for the lower risk, the less risk, if you will, with respect to gut distress. And that will allow you to really be consistent on taking in the fuel through the entirety of the bike to set you up better for the run. And, look at broader substrates. And this is not a sales pitch for Delta G, a great product. Of course, at this point in time, it's expensive, but we're looking at options to how we can broader or add more breadth to an athlete as it relates to substrate use. And we'll be coming back to you more on that from SFuels. But already today, there is, multiple substrates being used with SFuels. You have obviously the HBCD carbohydrate, fast-moving carbohydrate. You have the fast-moving C8 MCT fats. These are coming into the gut and into the bloodstream pretty fast. And then obviously you're also oxidizing your own endogenous carbohydrate stores, your own endogenous fats. So you're now already up to 4 substrates that you're oxidizing with SFuels. And then in Dan's case, he just shows you that if you get that right by really focusing on getting primed fat oxidation through the bike and consistent carbohydrate loading through the bike, you can basically on the run focus more on just fluids and salts and minor carbohydrate top-ups. So, I think it's a good example of, we talk a lot about, if you look at our most recent, I'll put the link in the YouTube video here. But if you go to our website, look at the learn section and go to guides, you'll see our latest usage guide. And on the left-hand side here, it talks exactly about this, which is taking the primed product prior to the race, 60 minutes prior to the race, and during that first 90 minutes of the race. So you get to that concentration that will help to, like I said, prime fat oxidation and uplift it. And then as you get into the race, if you look down the bottom here for Ironman 70.3, which is what we've been talking about today, we talk mostly about this, 60 grams per hour example on both the bike and the run. And, everyone's different. Everyone runs at different intensities. So they may throttle it back to 45 grams per hour on the bike. Some are running at 60 grams per hour on the bike. You can do the same in Olympic distance. You can do the same in half marathon, marathon, and ultra marathons. So take a look at it. And I think you'll find that it's a safer bet if you can get used to, really first focusing in your training on fat oxidation efficiency, getting that to an optimal level, priming it prior to your race start. And then in the race start, in that middle section, which for triathlons, of course, is the bike. In marathons or ultras, it's the middle of the race by duration. And focus there first and foremost on, consistent carbohydrate intake under 60 grams per hour. And as you get to the latter part of the race, you're going to find you've got sufficient both fat oxidation and glycogen stores still available to finish stronger. And that's what it's all about. Thanks very much for joining our show today. I hope you found that interesting. Look forward to talking to you more about some of the cases and races from all of our athletes around the world. Thanks again. And to all of you, happy 4th of July and enjoy your time with family and friends. Thanks again.